Welcome to another edition of Newsmaker Live. I'm Kindal Berton. Joining me this evening, Dr. Claudius Preville, Economist, Trade Advisor. Welcome to Newsmaker Live. Thank you very much for spending time with us, sir.
Thank you, Kindal.
I know you're no stranger to the media, but just in case there are people out there, as hard as it is to imagine, that don't know who Dr. Claudius Preville is, give us a little introduction to who the man is, what he does.
All right. Well, basically, you've already said an economist, a trade negotiator. I've done work also as a project manager. In the last 5 years, I developed my own consultancy, Preville & Associates Consulting, and we specialize in providing services to governments, regional organizations, international organizations, primarily of a development nature. I have done, prior to this, I've done work in the area of trade policy, in particular trade policy reform, capacity building, and so on many European Union projects throughout Africa, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, in addition to the Caribbean. I was involved in negotiations of the Economic Partnership Agreement between CARIFORUM and the European Union. Before that, the Free Trade Area of the Americas process between the Caribbean countries and the United States, of course, and the Latin American countries. I've done work on other trade agreements like the Caribbean, CARICOM, Colombia, CARICOM, Costa Rica, and so on. So, in a nutshell, these are the primary areas of interest. And yes, I'm looking forward to sharing some insights with you on areas, especially with regards to those themes.
Yeah, well, now that we've established your qualifications to answer some of the questions that I have for you this evening, and I imagine what the viewers will have for you a little later on, you delivered a feature address at the United Workers' Party's conference, the last conference that they had. You made a number of recommendations to the party that you thought, and I think other people thought, were good suggestions and ideas for the development and progress of the party. As you look at what's happening within the organization now, how do you feel?
This is a very tricky question, and the truth of the matter is that, you know, one has to wait and see exactly how the current situation unfolds. Reform is never an easy thing. Reform calls for tough decisions and tough actions. It also calls for vision, sagacity, and willingness to get things done. I think the reforms that we are witnessing in the United Workers' Party right now are no different from what we saw a decade and a half ago when the Labour Party was going for its reforms. It's in my view, it's a first step in a long journey that has to be undertaken by the party. The United Workers' Party, has a tradition of being a good party. It has a good history, but of course, some of that has been squandered along the way, and this is why reforms have to be done. As far as I'm aware, there are people actively working towards making this happen, and I think it's going to be a matter of time before all the pieces fall into place, and that process should be completed. So if you ask me, have they accomplished what they should have accomplished by now? I would say no. Is there hope? I think there is always hope, but there has to be more focus in terms of what they're trying to do. And I think messages of division does not serve any good purpose.
I'm going to ask you to make the same assessment of the ruling Labour Party. Have they accomplished what they should have by now after 2 years in office?
You know,
as an economist,
this is a challenge. The sad reality of not only Saint Lucia but many Caribbean countries is that political parties, they overextend themselves. They make so many promises at the time of campaigns, and they build expectations. And of course, those expectations in some cases are legitimate and others are not quite. And when they actually assume office, people expect them to fulfill what they've promised. Yeah, I don't have to go into the details about the better days and so on. They've not happened, and I would say in part they will not happen because of the current state of the world economy. Also, I don't quite see all the evidence of focused projects and programs on the part of the government itself that could have made it happen. So if you ask me whether they have fulfilled your expectations, I would say the answer is no. But again, as I said, the factors underlying this are not very simplistic to isolate. The causality is not very straightforward. One can't say it's one thing or the other, but probably more, the confluence of a number of factors that has resulted in this.
Right. You mentioned the world economic crisis. Saint Lucia, like a lot of the other islands and countries generally, have not been spared. One of the casualties has been Barbados. We heard about the BLP's decision to send home 3,000 employees, representing about 10% of the Barbados civil service. There have been hints that other islands may go that route. In your professional capacity, do you see that happening, and is that a way to go? Is Saint Lucia likely to go the same way? Is it advisable that we go that direction?
The thing about it, governments, I know a number of people out there would say government has to function and in a manner that actually takes on board the interests of all the electorate, all its population, all its residents. And to some extent this is correct, but one of the problems we have in St. Lucia and in the Caribbean countries in general is that governments tend to be too huge. Governments tend to be too inefficient. From my perspective, a government's primary role should be to facilitate, to provide facilitating services to the people, and to be a major player in sectors where you have natural monopoly. Things like road construction, things like airports and seaports, the large infrastructure, things like assuring, a high quality of education for everyone. These sorts of areas are areas where government intervention is required and government is expected to have a large, important role. Other areas of the productive economy, we expect those areas to be primarily under the control of the private sector. So everything from setting up hotels and restaurants, organizing your agriculture, setting up your spas for massages, doing various kinds of work in information technology. Those things should be in the private sector. So I think what needs to happen, and maybe the time has come when Caribbean governments would want to do a rethink on the way they function, revisit their role and their specific areas of focus in individual countries, and there should be a greater emphasis on engaging the private sector. So my perspective, I think there is a need to re-examine the entire functioning of public services throughout the region with the view to streamline them, make them more efficient, and make them more effective. For instance, I see no reason why we have a cabinet of 13 ministers. We can do it for about 7 ministers, the Prime Minister and 6 ministers. Increase the portfolios. When I say this, people say, but this is crazy. What do you mean that working with seven ministers, the Prime Minister and 6 ministers? My point is this. The cabinet contains ministers, and what's the role of ministers? Primarily policy formulation. Okay? Can you list for me 20 policies formulated by any one minister of government in the last 10 years? I'm sure you can't. Policy tends to be formulated once every 6 months or once a year, sometimes once every 2 years in a ministry. Government should function along the lines of having an efficient, in every ministry you have an efficient permanent secretary and its battery of staff. They should run the show in the ministry. Ministers should only have responsibility to come forward and formulate policy once they have been advised properly by the permanent secretary and their staff. So in this manner, what you will see is that there is no need to have a minister functioning on the basis of a job on a daily basis. Minister only need be in a ministry probably once a week or once every 2 weeks when there are policy actions to be taken, when there is a policy document to be reviewed and endorsed or turned down. That is where you need the minister. The permanent secretary and its staff supposed to be the ones running the operation. So if you understand it from that perspective, the case is made for the need for a lot less ministers running ministries, and perhaps maybe a little more permanent secretaries and equivalent personnel running the actual operations of ministries.
Yeah, but what you're suggesting is unheard of.
It's unheard of.
Can you give me an example of where
you're hearing of it tonight?
Okay.
If you I give you an example. A small economy in the Pacific region called the Cook Islands. It's amazing how they actually list the cabinet. You have a minister, and they actually list the portfolios 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 below the minister's name. This is how it's done, and it's a very streamlined, very, very straightforward. It's a smaller population than we have in Saint Lucia, yes, but I think this tradition, and let's face it, we must not forget the reason why we have so many ministers is because of the way our parliamentary democracy is set up. Okay. We have 17 constituencies. You need a parliamentary majority to form the government. So what you have is that if you have 11 seats, like the incumbent has 11 seats, the tendency is to appease as many of those elected members as possible so that you have a stable administration. Okay, this is what has been happening. We need to find ways to move away from this. Because my point is, we don't necessarily need to have all these persons named as ministers to do the work of ministers. Ministerial work is policy decision work. What needs to be done is to have much more efficient allocation of those portfolios, and you make greater use of some of those elected MPs in the constituency where they come from. This is what should be happening.
Right. I want to share something with you, and you give me your reaction to it. We were talking about the economic impact on the region, and one commentator says that the predicament engulfing Barbados and a lot of the other islands in the region speaks to the deeply rooted structural problems inevitably facing countries which import and consume much more than they produce and export, and which lack a competitive, productive base. Countries like Barbados lack the means to resolve this serious problem, as do many of the other islands in the region. Is that a fair assessment?
Lack of competitiveness, yes. I think this is one of the major problems we face in the region. Structural rigidities, yes indeed, this is a problem as well. And those rigidities are not only in terms of the production structure. We have, for example, take Saint Lucia, we have unemployment running at about 25% right now. Much of this unemployment is really structural unemployment. Okay? What do I mean by this? There is a mismatch between the demand and supply of labor. So you have people graduating from South Louis College. They're looking for jobs, right? The jobs they're looking for are not the sectors in which the hotels, the restaurants, and the private sector is seeking. So you find they have to end up being unemployed, even if they have skills. Okay, and ironically, you may also face the dilemma of having to approve work permits to bring foreigners. I mean, not just from other CARICOM states, even sometimes extra-regionally, to fill those vacancies. So we need to do some work in that area. I think there is a need for government to collaborate more with the private sector and the universities, our institutions of higher learning, to ensure that they are turning out the right quality of graduates, not just quantity, but turning out the right quality, so that the skills they have, there is demand for those skills in the market.
I want to get your views on initiatives like STEP, some of the other employment initiatives undertaken by the government. Some have suggested that they are, in essence, shifting jobs around without a net increase in employment. Do you share that view?
Frankly, those programs don't work. They provide temporary relief. I have no difficulty with a government that sees the need to be sympathetic to the underprivileged, the poor. And every government should have a heart extended to that. But the truth of the matter is those programs do not work. They are also a burden, a fiscal burden, which translates eventually into a debt burden. And we already know our debt to GDP ratio is in the region of 75% right now. We cannot entertain this kind of spending. My perspective, government should spend money not in creating jobs in STEP or NICE or SMILE. And by the way, I want to be very clear on this. When I say government, I'm not referring to government of the day alone per se, meaning the government of Dr. Kenny Anthony. Any government in power that promotes the notion of providing employment in this what I call artificial manner is misusing the funds of the country. I would prefer to see, for example, I give you a very simple example. We have freshwater shrimp and fish. That's a delicacy. The hotels, there's a huge demand for shrimp, huge demand for fish, etc. Why not get about 20, 50, 100 acres of land, and why not bring that on the freshwater shrimp and fish cultivation? That might provide employment for about 100, 200 farmers. Why not do that? That very money, if it costs, don't quote me on this, I'm not saying, I don't know what it costs to put in a freshwater shrimp farm, 100 acres. Let's say it's $10 million or $20 million. You make an investment, that investment will generate actual output, and that investment itself will create permanent employment. These are the kind of things we need to do. And while I'm on the subject of freshwater shrimp and fish, if government were to go the route of doing something like this, you would have, for example, the Taiwanese who have specialized technical expertise in the area. So it's not always about getting money. We have this culture in the region of government always going out there begging for money from foreign governments and so on. Sometimes what you really need is just the knowledge and the know-how. So you bring the Taiwanese, you have the expertise, you let them come in, let them do certain things in that area for you, and you yourself could match the funds. Maybe you put in $2 million and they put in $8 million to have a $10 million project, and you have a success story. I think my disappointment with the way I see government is functioning right now is that the plans and programs are not thought through thoroughly. They are designed to be temporary fixes. They provide short-term relief, but they themselves are fiscal burdens that become major debt burdens for the country, and they're not sustainable.
The Prime Minister has been accused of being high in expectation, low in substance in terms of addressing the country's economic issues. Do you share that view?
Who accused him of this?
Does it matter? Do you share the view or not?
Well, I mean, we spoke about expectations before, The expectations are in the manifesto, right? The blueprint for growth. And, I mean, the Prime Minister was in, the Labour Party was in opposition for 5 years. They had the time to put together a comprehensive blueprint for growth, as they call it. And if you have a comprehensive blueprint for growth, you expect to see economic growth of some reasonable numbers, I would say like 5-6%. You would expect to see the unemployment problem, subside. It has worsened. It was about 21% when he took over in 2011. It's now 25%.
24.9,
yeah. We could tweak the numbers a bit, but you get my point. So, and not to mention the debt situation has worsened significantly again on the current administration. So if you look at most of the macro indicators, performance of GDP, the debt sustainability, unemployment, all these indicators are pointing downwards. And so one cannot argue that we are facing prosperity. We are actually in many ways receding.
So when you hear the Prime Minister saying that the worst is over, we're turning the corner, how do you feel?
You want my honest opinion?
I don't want you to lie to me.
I know, honestly, I think there is still a lot more to go. And again, my appeal would be for a strong vision for Saint Lucia of where Saint Lucia should get in the next 10, 20 years. And that vision should be built. You see, we need to also be careful with political parties and organizations, right? We need to be very careful. Political organizations have become one of the problems of our economic growth and our economic and social development, because everybody wants to push an agenda to say, I know how best to do it. What our country needs urgently is a vision of where we would like to get to by a certain time. That's the first thing. And then we need to develop a comprehensive plan to fulfill that vision. That should be done on a bipartisan or a tripartisan basis, how many parties you have, as including civil society. We need to have a group of people to sit together, develop a vision for this country, formulate plans to make it happen. And so the government of the day, its job should just be to implement. It may have an approach to implementation that is different from the other government, but it should be essentially one. The difference between party A and B should be about implementation, but the goal should remain the same.
But hasn't the Prime Minister in his last budget address intimated that the government is moving in that direction?
I've heard talk of it. Have you seen any report on a vision for Saint Lucia? I have not seen. I'm not privy to that information. So I'm saying that we are going from budget cycle to budget cycle, and the whole governance approach is reactionary. There is no vision driving Saint Lucia. For example, do we wish to have a per capita GDP of $15,000 by 2030? Is that a goal? Do we wish to have jobs for every child living South Louis College, 15, 16 years old, up to about 30 years old? Do we want to have jobs for every single child leaving school by 2025? We need to set very hard, clear targets and then figure out what needs to be done to make it happen. That is what we have to do. So I think I understand government has the business of the day. They have to actually take care of day-to-day operations. But I think it's very important that they sit and put together this vision for the country, which should be done on a bipartisan, multi-partisan basis, that every St. Lucian could feel they have a sense of ownership in, and that whichever party comes to power would simply, its contribution would be in terms of its own style or approach in fulfilling the vision, but not in creating its own vision. It becomes a national vision. For a long time, Barbados had this sort of approach to its development. I think it has kind of lost its way along the way now, but that used to be the driver for most of the Eastern Caribbean region in terms of best practice. But as I said, we don't see evidence of best practice today for example, in Barbados.
One of the things that I've noticed, and you've just alluded to it not too long ago, that there's no shortage of ideas. What is lacking is for all of those ideas to contend and come together under one clear vision for the country. One of those I've heard is economic dualism. Is that applicable?
Dualism.
Maybe what is it? What
different
is
sectors.
dualism?
Different sectors. Well, I mean, the dual sector economy, having agriculture and manufacturing, or agriculture and services. I think you look at a country like St. Lucia, we're small. We need to not just focus on whether it should be dual or something else. We need to see where we are strong and develop that. So there is a role for agriculture in St. Lucia, okay? And despite agriculture's paltry share of GDP at about 5–6%, there is a major role for it, because what we saw in the days of bananas, when bananas were doing very well, agriculture contributed significantly to employment. In fact, the contribution of the agriculture sector to employment in its heyday of bananas, when it reached the contribution to GDP was about 13–14%. The employment effect was huge. We were talking about tens of thousands of people who were employed in that sector. If you compare with, for example, tourism today, one sees that the multiplier effect and the employment effect was nothing as great. So there is an important role. But I think one has to also juxtapose this on what is possible in other sectors like manufacturing. I think the manufacturing sector has potential, especially light manufacturing. I have seen recently, I was in St. Kitts 5 weeks ago. I was in St. Kitts, and St. Kitts is one tiny island, as you know. St. Kitts Navy is very tiny, 37,000 people. But they are the only OECS, and for that matter, the only CARICOM state to have successfully exploited the Caribbean Basin Initiative program, the various CBI regimes, to successfully export electronic products, especially in the category of relays and switches and transformers, to the European Union and the US markets. They've successfully exploited CBI, and now they're trying to do the same thing under the EPA. So what it says to me, tiny economy, everybody complain about the economies of scale, like especially the economies of yesteryear. They all talk about economies of scale, not there, you cannot do it. The cannot mentality. We need to graduate from this, because in my view, I'm not saying economies of scale don't exist, you know, don't misquote me, but I'm saying that the mentality that we cannot do things is what has held us behind. That mentality belongs in 1950 and 1960. And so we are literally living in 1950 and 1960 to the extent that we subscribe to this kind of thinking. We need to have new thinking. So we can see what St. Kitts can do. Saint Lucia has the same sort of expertise, the same sort of endowments. But have we made it an important issue for us to pursue this? Services, the third pillar. I think we can't grow the economy realistically. You cannot grow St. Lucia's economy on agriculture and manufacturing alone. The services GDP is about 85% of the economy. 85% of our economy is in services. I'm talking about everything from finance, tourism, real estate, you know, the whole ICT and so on. And so economic growth has to be, any expansion of economic growth has to focus heavily on those sectors, in addition to what one would do in agriculture and manufacturing.
You're talking about the agriculture sector, banana farmers and banana farming specifically in their heyday, so a while back. We heard this week about the Chiquita and Fife merger, basically ousting Dole from the #1 position, controlling up to 27% of the banana market, now looking to make inroads into the Middle East and Asia markets.
Yes.
How does that stand to impact the local banana industry and the regional industry? Or can we learn lessons from what's happening there and benefit from it in any way?
Well, it's, you know, we have all but, you know, left bananas in terms of production in the region. I mean, our numbers nowadays are, you know, nothing compared to what they were in the 90s, in the heyday of production. What has happened, keep in mind that, you know, Chiquita and Fifes, the main thrust of those companies are really the marketing side. They control the, you know, not so much, well, Chiquita has a lot of plantation interests in some Latin American countries. So does Fifes. But their focus has been more on the value, the high value adding side of the industry, which is the marketing, the ripening, the transportation, the distribution in Europe. This is where they're strong. And this is where the price and revenue for bananas sold escalates. So you literally go from farm gate prices of $1 or $2 to something like $12, $13, you know, for a box. And they are the ones who make the lion's share of that profit. Some time ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I had a discussion with some people in the banana industry. And one of the things I suggested to them is, why not at least try to do some of what Chiquita and Dole have been doing, Chiquita, Dole and Fifes, which is, why not focus on the marketing and distribution? But we were so emotionally charged about the industry. All people saw was the production side. But we were not as competitive in the production. However, we could have become competitive in the marketing, the distribution, the ripening, because this calls for technical knowledge and professional skill, not so much, you know, the manual labor that is being utilized to produce the bananas. for going forward, Saint Lucia needs to see where our strengths are, and I think industries like the banana industry are not going to be the leaders of our economic growth in the future. There might be a role for it, but it has to be substantially modernized and made much more efficient if it's going to work for us.
Okay. We're due for a break. We'll take that break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Claudius Preville, economist, trade negotiator. You're watching Newsmaker Live. I'm Kindal Berton. We'll be right back.